What if a boss disguised himself as a customer and humiliated his own employee in front of dozens of people? Is that cruelty, or could it be a test that changes their life forever? That evening, Hale's Prime glowed under the warm golden lights, reflecting off its luxurious glass panels like a statement of its undeniable class. But while wealthy guests basked in the soft music and swirling glasses of wine, a man entered who seemed entirely different from anyone else there. Tristan Hale, the owner of this famous restaurant chain, arrived in a perfectly tailored dark suit, but it wasn't his impeccable attire that drew attention. It was the cold, calculating gaze behind his thin, framed glasses. No one in the restaurant knew that he wasn't there just for dinner. He was there to conduct a ruthless test, one he had devised himself. Tristan had long been known as a master of control, obsessed with every detail, and tonight he wanted to see for himself what was truly happening behind the polished image reported to him every day. His steps were slow, almost arrogant, as he demanded table number 8, a table usually reserved for VIP guests, his voice low and firm, leaving no room for refusal. As the server led him through the dining hall, Tristan's eyes scanned every corner, every posture of the staff, the way they held the wine glasses, the precision of each pour. It was not the gaze of a customer enjoying a fine meal, but that of a predator searching for the slightest mistake. Sitting down, he placed his hands on the table, his fingers tapping rhythmically like a quiet drumbeat heralding the coming storm. In Tristan's mind, questions circled relentlessly. Were the people here truly worthy of the brand that bore his name? Were the values he had built from nothing now being eroded by carelessness, or worse, by the indifference of those working under the prestigious banner of Hale's Prime? The golden light reflected off his face, highlighting his sharp, cold features and the unwavering sternness in every movement. A lavish dinner was about to begin, but for Tristan Hale, this was no ordinary meal. This was a test, a carefully disguised trial wrapped in the veneer of luxury, where any mistake could become a final judgment on someone's future career. And the most terrifying part was that none of the people in the restaurant that night had the slightest idea that every gesture, every word, was being watched by the silent, calculating eyes of the man who owned it all. Aidan Ross stepped out from the kitchen carrying a tray filled with glasses of water, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to keep each glass steady. His uniform was faded, the hem slightly wrinkled, and loose threads at the cuffs betrayed the endless shifts that had worn it down. He moved quickly, but with a stiffness that showed how exhausted his body was, as if it no longer fully obeyed his will. Aidan kept a polite smile on his face, the kind every waiter was trained to maintain, but his eyes betrayed him. They were dry, tired, stripped of all hope. Tristan Hale watched every step, his gaze sharp and cold as a blade, dissecting each tiny gesture. He noticed immediately how Aidan lowered his head slightly to every guest, how he tilted the glass just enough to pour without spilling a single drop, how he adjusted a chair for an elderly couple before they even asked. These were the signs of a man who had been well trained, who once took pride in his work, but whose strength was now being eroded day by day. When Aidan finished serving one table, he quickly moved to the next, that same polite smile still fixed to his lips, like a mask he couldn't remove. Then a phone vibrated faintly in his pocket. Aidan hesitated, a flicker of worry crossing his face, before stepping back toward a quiet corner to answer. His voice was soft, almost fragile, as if he was afraid anyone might hear. "I'm fine, Mom. Did you take your medicine? Don't worry, I'll be home soon." He paused for a second, his eyes staring blankly into the distance, his voice even weaker now. "I promised, didn't I? Just 2 more months, and you'll get the treatment." With his free hand, he absent-mindedly wiped down a table that was already spotless, running his fingers along the polished wood out of habit, as if his body refused to stop working. At table 8, Tristan rested his chin on his hand, his eyes never leaving Aidan. His gaze was cold but deep, sharp with the practiced observation of a man who had spent years finding flaws in people. Part of him wanted to believe that this was just another replaceable employee, an insignificant cog in a larger machine. But another part of him, a part he didn't often acknowledge, was quietly moved by what he saw. A man exhausted to his core, but still clinging to his dignity. Tristan tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful, his gaze like that of a judge weighing a verdict. But in the golden light that touched his face, something shifted. A glimmer of curiosity sparked in his eyes. Perhaps this test was going to be far more interesting than he had anticipated. Tristan Hale leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlocked, his cold eyes following Aidan like a predator, preparing for its first strike. As Aidan approached table 8, bowing slightly with that practiced smile, Tristan lifted his glass of water, raising it to the light with a frown, as if he had just discovered something unacceptable. "Is this drinking water or dish soap?" His voice was low, sharp, each word dropping like a blade of ice. He set the glass down with just enough force for the water to slosh onto the coaster, the sound drawing the attention of a few nearby guests. Aidan froze for a fraction of a second, his hand gripping the tray trembling slightly, but he quickly nodded, keeping his tone polite. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll replace it right away." He turned and walked swiftly toward the kitchen, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if trying to hide his unease. Tristan watched him, the corner of his mouth lifting in a faint, unreadable smile, his icy gaze locked on Aidan as he returned with a fresh glass of water. But Tristan wasn't finished. Tilting his chin toward the chair, his tone carried the weight of a command. "This chair feels like a rock. Change it. I'm not paying to sit on this." Aidan hesitated for just a heartbeat, his eyes flickering with surprise, before he lowered his head and replied softly, "Yes, sir." He turned again, his hands gripping the chair, trembling slightly from exhaustion and pressure. Tristan did not miss that moment. His gaze was like a sharpened blade, slicing through every tiny detail, memorizing each reaction. At the service counter, Lucas Grant, the shift manager, stood with his arms crossed, his eyes drifting lazily toward Aidan before looking away, as if none of this concerned him. In contrast, Sophia Lane, the head chef, furrowed her brow from inside the kitchen, her eyes narrowing with suspicion as she caught a glimpse of Aidan struggling with the chair. She didn't know what was going on, but her instincts, honed over years in the industry, told her something was wrong. Meanwhile, Tristan reclined in his chair, his fingers tapping a steady rhythm on the tabletop, as if playing a tune only he could hear. He could feel the tension slowly spreading through the room, a few guests now casting annoyed glances in his direction, but he didn't care. This was exactly what he wanted, to push everything to the breaking point, little by little, until the waiter could no longer keep that calm mask in place. And Tristan knew this was only the beginning. Aidan leaned against the storeroom wall, his shoulders heavy, as if weighed down by the harsh stares from outside. His breathing came in short, uneven bursts, his hands covering his face, his palms damp with sweat. In these brief moments, he whispered to himself, so softly it was barely audible. Just 2 more months, Aidan. Just 2 more months. And Mum will get her treatment. Hold on. He repeated the words like a quiet prayer, trying to anchor himself to that fragile hope. Outside, the clatter of dishes and the hum of customers' conversations continued as usual, but in Aidan's mind, there was only a suffocating silence, his heartbeat pounding wildly out of control. He looked down at his hands, calloused and marked with tiny cracks, evidence of endless shifts from dawn till late at night. He clenched them tightly, as if squeezing out the last remnants of strength left in his weary body. The storeroom door creaked open slightly, and standing just beyond the hallway was Tristan Hale. He didn't step inside. He simply leaned against the doorframe, one hand resting thoughtfully on his chin, his cold eyes watching Aidan's every movement. In that moment, he looked like a silent judge, studying the man before him, teetering on the edge between resilience and collapse. Tristan said nothing, but the corner of his mouth curved ever so slightly. A faint, unreadable smile, caught somewhere between satisfaction and an emotion he himself couldn't quite name. In the kitchen, Sophia Lane continued peeling vegetables, but her eyes kept darting toward the storeroom door. Her instincts, sharpened by years in the business, told her something was wrong. She had seen many servers struggle after being berated by customers, but the look in Aidan's eyes before he disappeared into the storeroom wasn't mere frustration. It was the look of someone clinging desperately to the last thread, keeping them from breaking. Lucas Grant, the shift manager, was the complete opposite. He leaned casually against the counter, glancing once toward the storeroom, before shrugging and resuming his conversation with another staff member. He didn't even bother to ask if Aidan was okay. Inside, Aidan took a deep breath, pressing both hands against the wall, his eyes shut tight as he forced himself to steady his nerves. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, straightened his uniform, and forced his breathing into a calm, measured rhythm. A second later, he opened his eyes, and the calm, professional gaze of a server returned, or at least the mask he needed to wear outside did. Placing a hand on the door handle, he whispered to himself one last time, "For Mum." Tristan remained silent in the hallway, his gaze fixed firmly on the door. As Aidan stepped out, Tristan tilted his head slightly, his expression that of a strategist contemplating his next move. Because in Tristan's mind, this test was only just beginning, and Aidan had no idea he was already a pawn in a ruthless game. The atmosphere at Hale's Prime froze the moment Tristan Hale set his knife down on the plate, his gaze dropping to the slice of Wagyu he had just cut. For an instant, time seemed to slow. The voices of other diners blended into a distant hum, indistinct and muted. Tristan lifted his eyes to Aidan, his stare sharp as a blade, and slowly shook his head. His voice was low, each word deliberate, heavy like a verdict. This is not worth $200. Do you think I'm stupid? The sharp clink of the knife and fork hitting the plate echoed harshly, drawing the attention of nearby diners who paused mid-bite, curiosity flickering in their eyes as they turned toward the table 8. Aidan froze in place, the serving tray in his hands tilting slightly, the sauce from another plate almost spilling over the edge. He lowered his head and forced himself to speak, his voice hoarse and trembling. I'm sorry, sir. I'll bring you a new dish right away. But Tristan cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand, his tone cold and dismissive. I don't need cheap apologies. If you think I pay to eat garbage like this, you're wrong. His voice wasn't loud, but the disdain in every word was enough to silence the entire room. Murmurs began to ripple through the diners. A few whispered to each other, glancing at Aidan with mixed expressions of discomfort and intrigue. An elderly woman shook her head in disapproval, while a young couple lowered their gazes, pretending to focus on their meal, though their eyes kept darting toward the scene. Aidan felt his throat tighten, a bead of sweat sliding down his temple. His fingers gripped the tray so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Waves of humiliation crashed through him, but the strained smile on his face remained, the unspoken rule of every server forbidding him to let it falter. He lowered his head even more, his voice barely audible, as if afraid anyone else might hear. Yes, sir. Tristan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his fingers tapping slowly on the surface in a steady rhythm, his eyes locked on Aidan. His tone dropped even lower, cold and metallic. Bring me the bill. When Aidan placed the receipt on the table, his hands trembled so much that the paper shook slightly. Tristan snatched it up, his eyes scanning the total, then suddenly slammed it back down. The sharp crack of paper hitting wood cut through the air, freezing the entire restaurant. His voice rose just enough for everyone nearby to hear. $200 for a meal like this? Do you think I'm that easy to fool? Aidan bit his lip, his throat tightening as a single tear slipped down his cheek, catching the warm golden light above. He didn't wipe it away. He didn't dare look up. He stood there, motionless, like a statue, bearing the crushing weight of dozens of eyes staring at him. Tristan remained seated, his gaze cold and unyielding, like a judge who required no defense from the accused. And none of the witnesses that night, not a single diner in that restaurant, had any idea that this wasn't simply the anger of a demanding customer, but a calculated test, a meticulously staged performance designed to push Aidan to his breaking point. The private room door closed softly, muffling the sounds from outside, leaving behind a heavy, almost suffocating silence. Aidan stood with his head bowed, arms hanging loosely at his sides, looking like a soldier who had just lost a battle. In front of him, Tristan Hale sat on a dark wooden chair, the cold white light above casting sharp shadows across his face, accentuating every stern line. But this time, he didn't speak right away. Instead, Tristan slowly reached up, removed the thin framed glasses resting on his nose, and placed them on the table. Then, with deliberate war, he peeled away the false beard that had concealed half his face. A thin layer of adhesive came loose, revealing the real face, the face every employee at Hale's Prime had seen countless times on the posters displayed in the main lobby. Aiden's head jerked up, his eyes wide with shock, his body trembling as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. His lips parted, but no words came out. His breathing quickened, uneven. You're Tristan Hale." His voice was hoarse, choked, the kind of question asked by someone who was almost afraid of hearing the answer. Tristan stared straight at him, his gaze unnervingly calm, and gave a slow nod. "Yes. And you've just been serving your own boss." Aiden stumbled back a step, his shoulders pressing against the wall, his fingers clutching the hem of his uniform shirt, as if trying to hold on to whatever composure he had left. His whole body trembled, not out of fear of a powerful customer, but from the shock of realizing that all the humiliation he had just endured was not an accident. Tristan rose from his chair, each slow step toward Aiden deliberate, the sound of his polished leather shoes against the wooden floor echoing in a measured rhythm, heavy with tension. When he stopped in front of him, one hand resting lightly on the table, the other on the back of the chair, his voice was low, steady, but carried the weight of a verdict. I needed to know if the people working under my name were worthy, and I had to see with my own eyes how they reacted when pushed to the limit. He paused for a beat, his eyes locking onto Aiden's. "You didn't give up." Aiden opened his mouth as if to say something, but the words caught in his throat. His expression was a storm of emotions: shock, humiliation, and finally a deep, aching pain. A single tear slid down his cheek, this time not from shame, but from the realization that everything he had endured was deliberately orchestrated. Tristan took a step back, drawing in a deep breath, as if he himself was wrestling with his own emotions. The initial coldness in his eyes seemed to fade, replaced by a different kind of severity. Not that of a man simply judging an employee, but of someone on the verge of making a life-changing decision. The room fell into absolute silence, broken only by the sound of Aiden's uneven breathing. Tristan looked at him one last time, his voice dropping, slower now, each word deliberate. "From this moment on, your life will never be the same." Tristan Hale stood tall, his hands clasped in front of his chest, his expression firm but no longer as cold as before. He stepped closer to Aiden, stopping just a few feet away, his voice deep and measured, each word striking the heavy silence like a hammer. "You have done better than anyone I have ever tested, and I do not say this lightly." He paused for a moment, then continued, his tone lowering, steady and unwavering. "Tomorrow, $15,000 will be transferred into your account, enough to cover your mother's treatment." Aiden froze, his eyes wide, his breath uneven. Those words hit him like a ray of light breaking through the dark sky he had been trapped under for months. His lips trembled, wanting to speak, but his throat tightened, refusing to let any sound escape. A single tear slid down his cheek, no longer hidden, falling freely to the wooden floor with a soft tap, like a quiet release. I can't accept that money. I don't deserve it." Aiden shook his head weakly, his voice trembling, breaking, as if he still couldn't believe what was happening. Tristan stepped forward and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. His grip was steady, radiating a strange sense of reassurance. For the first time that night, a flicker of warmth appeared in his sharp eyes, a genuine emotion so rare it felt almost unreal coming from a man known for his coldness. It's not about whether you choose to accept it. This is not a gift. You have earned every dollar with everything you've endured. Aidan lowered his head, his hands trembling, no longer from pressure, but from the overwhelming release building in his chest. He tried to suppress a sob, but failed. A sharp breath escaped him, followed by a choked sound, his hand rising to cover his face, though tears streamed uncontrollably between his fingers. The walls of resilience he had built for so long finally crumbled completely in that moment. Tristan didn't remove his hand from Aidan's shoulder. He held it there, his voice steady, carrying the weight of a promise. There is one more thing I want to say to you, Aidan. I want you to join Hales Prime's management training program. I need people like you, people who truly understand what dedication means, to keep the soul of this restaurant alive. Aidan looked up, his eyes red and swollen, staring at Tristan in disbelief. His lips parted as if to ask a question, but no words came out. In those tired eyes, a faint, fragile spark flickered to life. It wasn't just hope. It was something deeper, something Tristan had planted with those words, the beginning of a new kind of faith. Outside the private room, the kitchen had begun to return to its usual rhythm, but not for everyone. Sophia Lane stood by the prep counter, quietly wiping a knife with a white cloth, her eyes repeatedly drifting toward the closed door. Since the moment Tristan and Aidan stepped into that room, Sophia had been unable to focus on anything else. Her instincts told her that something important was happening inside, something that could change everything. Beside her, Lucas Grant, the shift manager, leaned against the bar, his face tense with annoyance at the hushed whispers spreading among the staff. He tried to maintain an air of indifference, but his restlessness had begun to seep through every gesture. His fingers tapped an unconscious rhythm on the counter, and his eyes darted toward the private room, betraying a nervousness he could no longer mask. A few minutes later, the door swung open, and a shaft of white light spilled out into the kitchen. Tristan Hale stepped out first. He didn't look at anyone, simply walking past with a calm expression, his gaze firm but carrying something different now, a weighty sense of resolve. Right behind him, Aidan emerged, his eyes still red but transformed in a way that couldn't be ignored. His posture was no longer slouched and drained. Instead, he carried himself with a quiet steadiness, as if a new door had just opened inside him. Sophia's eyes widened in surprise. She stepped closer to Lucas, her voice low but firm. "Do you see that? Something happened. He's not the same anymore." Lucas didn't respond immediately. His eyes followed Aidan as the young man walked slowly back toward the counter, still carrying his serving tray, but with movements now marked by a newfound certainty. Lucas swallowed hard, a quiet sigh slipping out before he murmured, almost to himself, "I was wrong." Sophia glanced at him, her expression softening. She gently placed a hand on his shoulder, a small gesture, but one filled with meaning, a reminder that it wasn't always too late to change. Lucas gave a slight nod, his gaze shifting away from Aidan to the front entrance where Tristan had just disappeared. For the first time, there was self-reflection in his eyes, a rare feeling for a manager who had grown too accustomed to giving orders and forgetting that he, too, needed to learn how to see people. And none of them knew, Everything that had just happened had been recorded by a security camera in the corner. A camera Tristan Hale had deliberately left running. He wanted not just Aidan, but every single person working at Hale's Prime to witness this truth, to look at themselves, truly look, at least once in their lives. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the large glass windows, reflecting off the polished wooden floor of Hale's Prime. The restaurant was just as busy as any other day, but there was something different in the air, a sense of freshness, lightness, and hope. In the main dining area, Aidan Ross moved between the tables with a completely new presence. He still wore the same old uniform. His hands still bore the same calluses, but every step he took, every smile he offered, now carried a remarkable strength, confidence, and pride. Aidan was no longer the exhausted waiter struggling to hide his despair. He stopped at a table where a group of new staff members stood, patiently showing them how to place cutlery correctly, how to bow just enough when pouring wine, and how to smile in a way that made guests feel truly respected. Every word he spoke came from his own experience, making the young employees listen intently as if learning from a true mentor. "Do everything as if that meal was for your own family," Aidan said softly, his tone gentle yet firm, and his eyes shone with a newfound conviction. From across the room, Sophia Lane stood with her arms crossed, leaning lightly against the kitchen counter, her eyes following Aidan with quiet admiration. A rare smile curved her lips, something almost forgotten in her long, stressful years in the kitchen. Beside her, Lucas Grant also watched in silence, his face reflecting undeniable change. He nodded slightly, his eyes no longer holding their usual arrogance, but instead showing acknowledgement, even respect, for the man he had once dismissed. Outside the window, Tristan Hale stood leaning lightly against the doorframe, his hands tucked into the pockets of his long coat. He didn't step inside, only watched silently through the clear glass. For the first time, his gaze softened, no longer carrying the coldness of the previous night. He looked at Aidan, the corner of his mouth lifting into a rare smile, a proud smile, like that of a teacher pleased to see his student finally grow. Then Tristan turned away, walking slowly down the bustling street, his eyes fixed ahead, his voice low and warm, meant only for himself. The test has only just begun. There was no longer doubt or anger in his expression, only determination. Because deep down, Tristan knew this wasn't just about rewarding a dedicated employee. It was the first step in reviving an entire system, to restore the true meaning of the name Hale's Prime. A place where every dish, every smile, must carry within it the value of genuine kindness. That evening, Hale's Prime glowed under the warm golden lights, its glass windows reflecting the image of a luxurious restaurant. But inside, something far more important was beginning to take shape. In the dining area, Aidan Ross sat with Sophia Lane and Lucas Grant at an empty table after closing time. There were no more clinking dishes or customers' laughter, only silence and the soft glow of ceiling lights. Aidan sat upright, his hands clasped together, but the smile on his face now was genuine, no longer the forced smile meant to please guests. Sophia nodded slightly at him, her eyes carrying a respect she had never given to any waiter before. Lucas, the once arrogant and indifferent manager, sat quietly, his eyes lowered as if offering an unspoken apology. "I want to learn from you, Aiden," Lucas said softly, his voice low and sincere, breaking the silence. Aiden looked surprised for a moment, then nodded slightly, his eyes reflecting gratitude. The restaurant was no longer just a place to serve expensive meals. It was slowly becoming a place where people began to understand what respect and kindness truly meant. The younger staff looked at Aiden with admiration, learning from the way he spoke to guests, from the way he taught them to keep pride in their work. And for the first time in many months, Aiden felt he truly belonged here, not just as an ordinary waiter, but as part of something greater. Outside, on the stone-paved sidewalk, Tristan Hale stood alone, the night breeze gently stirring his hair. He didn't step inside, only watched quietly through the glass. On his face appeared a faint smile, not a fleeting smile of satisfaction, but the smile of a man who had regained his faith. He spoke softly, his deep voice sounding more like words meant for himself than anyone else. "The true value doesn't lie in $200 on a bill, but in the people who make it possible." Tristan turned and walked away, his figure slowly disappearing into the darkness, leaving behind the warm glow of Hale's prime shining brightly like a promise of change. And somewhere, as if sending a quiet message to anyone who has ever worked silently without being recognized, the narrator's voice gently rose. "If you've ever given your all to your work without anyone noticing, leave a comment. I understand." The story closed not with applause or praise, but with a simple message strong enough to move any heart. Sometimes, true value is not measured in money, but in those who dare to hold on to kindness in silence. Sometimes, the harshest tests reveal the true values we often overlook: resilience, kindness, and pride in one's work. That is the very soul of any organization. If you also believe that every effort deserves to be appreciated, hit like and subscribe to help us share meaningful stories like this one. And leave a comment with 3 words, "I understand." Because only those who have experienced it can truly feel the weight of that value.